Today we're going to be talking about Swiss made. We're going to go over kind of some of the specifications for being Swiss made, talk about maybe where the stuff exactly is being made. I have done a ton of research. I reached back into my graduate student days to put this together for you guys. So we're going to take a look at that. But before we do that, I want to give you a look at what I'm wearing. This is the Citizen Grand Touring, and I have it on this fantastic Wrist Candy Watch Club combination strap. To be honest, I don't know what took me so long to try these out. They're really soft, incredibly comfortable. If you haven't tried one, where have you been? So now let's get into Swiss made. Or is it? That's coming up right after this. Alright guys, and welcome back. So first thing, excuse me if I look down, I've got a ton of notes that I put together for this to make sure that I have all my facts straight. The first thing I'd like to do is go over exactly what Swiss made means. 3 criteria that a piece has to meet in order to have Swiss made on the dial. The first one is that it has to have a Swiss movement. The second one is that the movement has to be cased up in Switzerland. And the third requirement is that the final inspection for the watch takes place by the manufacturer, also in Switzerland. Okay, so that first requirement, that the movement has to be Swiss. In order for a movement to be Swiss, it also has to meet 3 specific criteria. The 3 criteria for a movement to be Swiss is that it has to be assembled in Switzerland. The second one is that it has to be inspected by the manufacturer in Switzerland. The third one is the most interesting one, and that's that 50% of the value of the movement, or the cost of the movement, has to be from a Swiss manufacturer. So Swiss manufactured pieces. That doesn't mean, that doesn't include the cost of labor to put together. So that just means that literally just parts. There's main parts of every movement that are typically always coming from Swiss manufacturers, right? So we're talking balance wheels, springs, mainsprings, and jewels. Those could be the only Swiss parts. And the rest of them could be parts that are sourced from outside of Switzerland. But if the cost for those parts is 50%, at least 50%, which means they're much more expensive than the rest of the movement's pieces combined, it can still be a Swiss movement. Okay, so that doesn't mean that half the movement is Swiss. It could really be, let's say, 25% of the movement that are actually Swiss parts. But the monetary value on the paperwork for the parts are half Swiss, half somewhere else. Bam, Swiss movement, which means it's now eligible to meet the other 3 criteria to have Swiss made on the dial. And that's the requirements as they stand now. They're going to change down the line, and we'll get into that later. As of 2013, 70% of the movements used by Swiss watchmakers were made by ETA. Then you have 90% of balance springs were supplied by Niverox, which is coincidentally a subsidiary of ETA. Now, we do know that ETA is going to be dwindling down what they will be supplying in the future, and some of that has started. Contrary to popular belief, yes, the Swatch Group is able to restrict the distribution of movements by ETA, but it's not as clean cut as you would think it is. The Swiss Federation Competition Commission has restricted the rate at which they can do that. Now, this is based on companies that already had sales agreements, purchase agreements with Swatch, maybe where they purchase these movements regularly. So the Swiss Commission has stipulated how they can do this, how Swatch can do this based on those purchase agreements. And this is what they decided. So in 2014 and 2015, 75% of the reference quantity. So that means whatever your purchase agreement is, Swatch will only be required to fulfill 75% of the amount that you've requested from them or from ETA. Now for 2016 and 2017, they will only have to fulfill 65% of that reference quantity. In 2018 and 2019, that's going to be down to them only having to fulfill 55% of the reference quantity. And after December 31st of 2019, there's going to be no legal obligation per the Swiss Federation Competition Commission for Swatch to fulfill, or for ETA to fulfill any of those purchase obligations. So really what you're looking at is by January 1st, 2020, they won't be obligated to fulfill anything to anyone. Now, there are other Swiss movement companies that are rushing in and moving to try to keep up and fill the gap that's going to be left by ETA, obviously. Manufacturers like Salida and Soprod that will still allow somebody to have a Swiss movement and thus have Swiss made on the dial. Now, all that out of the way, where are the parts for these Swiss made pieces really coming from? So let's take a look at that. Now, first of all, there are several traditional brands and several very historied brands that are not going to be willing and are not willing to get parts beyond Swiss borders to put their pieces together, regardless of the cost. But there are those that aren't going to mind going to source cheaper parts or to source parts that are going to be more readily available in the future, but they're transparent about it. That's the second category. An example of that is in 2012, the then Tag Heuer CEO, which was Jean-Christophe Babin, announced that their caliber 1887, which is a chronograph movement, was going to be using parts from Seiko. So they were very transparent in that they were going to be sourcing parts from elsewhere in order to put together some of their calibers. In addition to that, you also have some boutique brands, micro brands that are very transparent about where they're getting their pieces, and they have no issues with that. One example comes from the founder of 7 Fridays. He's very transparent about where he gets his pieces, and he also contends that if he had to adhere to the requirements to put Swiss made on the dial in terms of price, he'd have to raise the 7 Friday pieces to up to 80% more than they're retailing for now, and points out then where the value would be for the consumer just to have Swiss made on the dial. Additionally, he points out, which is pretty interesting, is that there may be 100 watch factories in Switzerland, but there's 1,000, for example, watch factories in China, and a very select group of those can put out very, very high quality watch pieces and are used exclusively by several Swiss brands. Now, Mr. Pache, and I might be slaughtering the name, I do apologize, but even Mr. Pache, who's the president of the Federation of the Swiss Watch Industry, acknowledges the quality of Chinese watch products. He contends that if Swiss watchmakers are using them, it's because they're meeting the quality requirements of those specific manufacturers. Now, he is very quick to follow up with the fact that Swiss manufacturing is still a better option over anything you can find anywhere else. There was also a Swiss watch movement maker who didn't want to be identified in the article that he was a source for, and he was quoted as saying that you can find very high quality parts in Asia, and it's not better just because it was made or produced in Switzerland. Getting components such as cases, straps, for example, or dials from China has been the norm for decades. Granted, this is predominantly for smaller and mid-sized brands that can afford to get those components or have those components made in Switzerland. Let's take a look at some very interesting export-import numbers and statistics that I actually got from the Swiss and World Watch Industries report from 2014, which is the most recent one available at the moment. The average price of a watch leaving Hong Kong and China, which the report separated as two markets, although they're the same country, the average price of a watch leaving Hong Kong and China was $13.50. The average price of a Swiss watch export was $803. And these are all US dollar values, okay? Here's where it gets interesting though. In terms of countries that imported watch components, or watch products, so now we're talking cases, dials, bracelets, for example, movement parts, etc. The number one importer of watch industry products was Hong Kong. They also turned around and re-exported a high amount of the products that they had imported in the first place. That's followed by the United States, who's second. And then Switzerland is the third greatest importer of watch parts. This was an increase of 8% over the previous year, 2013. Hong Kong and China are top exporters, and the Swiss are among the top 3 importers of watch industry products, okay? So I'm not going to make an assumption about where those parts are coming from, and I'm sure that you have countries like Germany or France even that are among the countries that the Swiss might be importing parts from. But in 2013, there was a landmark free trade agreement that took place between China and Switzerland that went into effect in 2014, which was coincidentally the same year that their import of watch products increased 8% over the previous year. So all that said, there is a new Swissness Bill that was passed in 2013, and here's what that's going to do. So the first thing that you're going to see is the requirements that we went over in the beginning of the video for something to be Swiss made or to be stamped Swiss made. The first requirement was that the movement had to be Swiss. Now, specifically for that movement, it meant that 50% of the value of the movement had to be from Swiss components. In the new Swiss made bill, that value is going to be increased from 50% to 60%. But more specifically, that 60% is going to be expanded to include the overall value of the watch, which is going to include things like cases, for example, versus just the movement, which is what it currently applies to now. So that's going to be a significant increase. Now, here's where it gets here's where you're going to get into a lot of gray area with determining what is Swiss and what isn't in terms of meeting that 60%. What's also going to now count towards 60% of that overall value are things like research and development in addition to certification costs. Those are things that don't count towards meeting that 50% now, but they're going to count towards meeting the 60% when the bill takes effect. All right, so at the end of the day, really with all this, it's what does it mean for us? Right off the bat, the biggest thing, and this is one of these concerns was raised by Ronnie Burheim, who is head of Mondain, which is the watchmaker for the Swiss railway clocks. He actually thinks that it could have a negative impact on quality. And the reason for that is that smaller brands and lower priced watches might end up buying even cheaper components elsewhere overseas, which is going to inadvertently increase the value of the Swiss components, which would still allow them to hit that 60% with an overall lower quality product that would now potentially qualify to be called Swiss made. Let's take a look at current outsourcing and future price impacts for us at the end of the day. All right, so in this first example, if you have a $500 watch, and let's say the cost to manufacture it is $200, they have a $300 profit. Now, I think StyleCon questioned this in one of his videos they put out in terms of cost savings and not passing that to us. So let's say they're able to outsource some of the products for the same overall quality, but they're able to outsource some components of the watch and reduce their cost of manufacturing $50. What's not going to happen is that they're not going to reduce their cost of manufacturing to $150 and keep their profit margin $300, which means they would pass that savings to us. They'd pass the savings to us, and now that same piece would turn around and cost us $450 instead of $500. That's not going to happen. I mean, at the end of the day, it is a business, and they're in the business of making money. So if they search for reductions in operating or production costs, it's strictly to increase their profit margin. That means if they're able to cut production costs by $50, the cost to us is still going to be $500. The only difference is they're going to have a $350 profit now versus the $300 profit they had when it cost them $50 more to make the same watch. Here's where it could be a big issue in the future though. If that same $500 watch goes from $200 to manufacture up to $300 to manufacture, what they're not going to do is that extra $100 for manufacturing costs, they're not going to let that eat into their profit. So that means that $500 watch before is now going to cost us $600, because if they have to increase their manufacturing costs to meet new Swiss made requirements or whatever the case may be down the line, if their production cost goes up as a result of that, $100, and this is just an example, goes up $100, that's going to be passed to us. So that $500 watch is going to now be $600. Now, one of the main reasons they're going to do this is if they think that the consumer is willing to pay that increased cost for having Swiss made on the dial. And as it is now, there's really no reason for them to think that we're not going to pay it. At the end of the day, we have put a very high premium on the Swiss made label. And the reality is that part of the current requirement is completely superficial, arguably superficial to one extent. everything, as the requirements are right now, everything minus the movement, which has its own loopholes to meet that 50%, can be manufactured elsewhere by the current standards, as long as it's put together in Switzerland and inspected in Switzerland by the manufacturer. So in terms of component percentage, very little of that piece might actually have been made in Switzerland and can still technically have Swiss made on the dial. That said, the reality is that some very high quality and, dare I say, comparable manufacturing can be done overseas. So as consumers, I don't think that we should tie our hands to Swiss made, and we should be able to look at pieces for the quality they actually present in relationship to the price that they're asking for it, regardless of wherever made is found on the dial. So if you thought Swiss made always meant Swiss made, now you know it's a term that really has minimal requirements that at the end of the day ultimately reflect the interdependence and globalization that we're all a part of today. So if you're willing to pay premium for something you like, I think you should pay it because you like it, but don't pay it because it says Swiss made across the bottom. There's a lot of options, a lot of brands to discover, and Asia as a whole has come a long way in terms of what they can produce, and they're going further. So I'd love to hear what you guys think regarding this topic. I have all my references linked up below if you'd like to check them out. As usual, if this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. That's it for this one. CG out.